So now we're going to do the chord. Now, usually, of course, we go File, Set Project, kind of load the scene in this case. I just already have the lamp scene up. So what we want to do is our last bit for the lamp here. We want to do the chord, right? Now, this is going to be some more spline modeling stuff, and it's going to give me the opportunity to talk to you about history again and how to output polygons, because NURBS are just really hard to work with. But spline modeling can be sometimes cool. Now, in this case, we want to make a chord, right? Now, you guys don't have to make the end plug for it. If you want to, you can try it. Not a big deal. I'm really just looking at the main chord shape itself because that's showing me, how to use this specific tool, right? The plug itself would really just be its own separate object. You start with the cube, put some edges on it, extrude some stuff out, right? But you guys don't have to make that. I'm really just looking for the actual chord itself, not the actual little plug that goes in the outline on the end. So really what that is that's going to be an extrusion feature using splines, right? Because we've seen lofting already from surface bending, we've seen revolve, right? And before we're done, we'll see the bi-rail video, but that'll be our later videos for our next class session, right? Because there's enough stuff to do on this one that, and less ones on the next one that we'll save the bi-rail video for later in the week. All right, so at this point, though, we want to use the extrusion feature here, but we need some curves set up for it, right? So much like the loft, we need, at least for the specific option, we're going to use 2 curves, right? The revolve, we only need 1 curve for. Lofting, we needed a couple because it kind of created really a bridge between curves, right? It created geometry between those curves. So in this case, what we need, since we're going to use the tube function of that curve tool feature, what we're going to do is we're going to use a circle, a NURBS primitive circle, right? And a curve that we draw on our own, right? Because we need a shape that we're going to extrude, and we need a curve that we're going to extrude that other curve along. So we're going to start off with the NURBS primitive circle. So we're just going to go to create NURBS primitive. Probably the one NURBS primitive I had to get you guys to use is circle. All the rest of these are just going to make you hate it, right? So NURBS primitive circle. And that's going to create a giant circle, right? So it needs to be smaller, so we're going to hit R for scale, right? And we're going to grab that center one, right? So we're going to left click, grab that center one. Now in this case, I'm also going to move it over a little bit because this doesn't need to stay on the center to work properly. So we'll hit W for move. And I'll grab just the red arrow, just move it over a little bit, right? So remember, W for move, grab that red arrow. And we'll hit R for scale again. Grab that center one, right? Usually it'll be light blue if it wasn't selected already. Go like left click drag on that to make it smaller. There we go. And that's getting pretty close to the size we want for that. Now I'm going to hit F really quick just to frame selection, right? Remember, F is that great quick key for framing selection. A is fit all, right? So it fits everything in the scene is A. F is frame selection, right? So whatever's selected, in this case an object, but it could be, like I said, an edge loop, faces, right? Whatever's selected, it'll fit, or frame. Now in this case, I don't really want it to be exactly a circle. If you did want a rope or like a hose, leave it as a circle, you're good. But I want it to be a little more pinched in, because when you actually look at chords, they're kind of like ridged, pinched in a little bit. So remember, if I put my cursor over, right, this selection, the curve, and I hold down right mouse button, because that works just like it does for polygons. If you put your cursor over the object and you hold down right mouse button, it brings up your marking menu, right? And you'll see that there's control vertex, or CV, right? That's kind of that CV curve tool and all that stuff. Control vertex, right? So there we go. Now, what we can do is we can actually select kind of these 2 points, right? So I just select this one, and then I hold down Shift. Remember, Shift adds to selections. And then I'll left-click drag, right, so that both are selected. In this case, I do want the scale tool on, so R for scale. What I want to do is I just want to scale these 2 vertices that are across from each other in. And because the manipulator by default is set to the center of that selection, when it scales them along one axis, it pinches them inward. And you see how that kind of creates that nice little kind of chord shape there? So that's how you create that basic shape that's going to be the chord, right? And then you just go back to object mode. There we go. And there's the actual shape of the chord itself, right? And now we need to create the curve that it's going to be extruded along, the path it's going to be extruded along. So in this case, I'm going to tap spacebar, right? Because remember, tapping spacebar goes out to your 4 views, right? And we've seen this before, right? That tapping spacebar. So once again, as we go on, we get more used to and more comfortable with Maya because we're learning and using a lot of the same stuff again. Now in this case, I'm going to put my cursor over the top view. Remember, A and F work independently in the viewport. So if I hit A for fit all in this viewport, you see how it kind of shows everything? I can also hit 4 for wireframe or 5 for shaded independent of this viewport. You see how it kind of works independent depending on what viewport your cursor is over, right? So in this case, my viewport's over this, or my cursor's over this viewport. Now if I wanted to, I could of course tap spacebar with my cursor over this viewport and it maximizes the top view, right? Now your navigation works the same here. Alt middle, Alt right, Alt left doesn't work though, right? Because it tells you right up here orthographic views are currently locked. That means you're not supposed to be able to rotate the view when you're in a top or a front or side view. Remember, orthographic means without perspective. But Alt middle for move and Alt right for zoom still works. Now what I need to do is I need to draw the path itself for this shape. So I'm going to go back to Create, Curve Tools, CV Curve Tool. Now you notice there are kind of a couple of other curve types here. There's EP curve and there's Bezier curve. And I'm going to go over those in pencil curve. I'm going to go over these in a basic way. We've seen if you go to CV Curve Tool Options box, we can tell it to have different degrees, right? If you turn it to be linear, you see when we draw, kind of just makes it kind of boxier and edgier. Hit Enter, and I'm just going to delete because I don't want that. And of course, we'll set it back to 3-degree cubic. Remember, when you have 3-degree cubic on, you need at least 4 points to make it. The start point, the end point, and then at least 2 other control vertices to get and create curvature. All right. So I'm going to delete that again because I want to show you a few of these other ones really quick. So I'm going to go to Curve Tools. EP Curve Tool is actually pretty similar, but what it does is it kind of draws the actual proper edit points, right? So you see how it kind of does behave a little bit differently. And we'll hit Enter. And you'll notice there is actually an edit point option. When you hold down right mouse button, you can go to Edit Point. And you'll notice you can move edit points also. But you see how kind of the behavior of those curves works a little bit differently, right? So they behave a little bit different. But instead of the actual control vertices, it's actually the true kind of points, if you will, right? The actual edit points. But generally, a very similar kind of curve, right? It's not really going to matter which one you use for the most part. There is a Bezier curve, and that's a bit different because it does give you Bezier handles. And so when I draw this, you'll see how it kind of gives me a curve. And then we could draw out, and it gives me kind of these handles, right? And of course, we can hit Enter, and we can go to Control Vertex, and you see how there's these actual handles there. And so you see how it allows you to change the curves. You have Bezier handles there. I want to say it's Control Click or Shift Click. I'm trying to remember what it is. But there's like a way to break it. I'm trying to remember what it is. I rarely ever use Bezier curves here. But you can actually break to have these be independent of each other. In this case, though, we don't really have to worry about it too much. But this is the actual point it's moving, and these are kind of controlling the angle with which it moves at. So just kind of keep that in mind. The Bezier curve definitely has its own distinct kind of ways. And then we go to Create Curve Tools, and there's Pencil Curve Tool, and this really just kind of lets you draw in a shape. Now you'll notice when you go to Control Vertex for that one, it's got a lot of points, right? It's kind of not super clean. But these are kind of these couple of different curve types that you have available to you, right? You're probably usually going to be fine using CV curve, to be honest. But we do have a couple of other curve types that do behave differently. CV curve and EP curve behave quite similar, but one you're controlling the control vertices, the other one you're actually controlling the direct edit points. Bezier actually gives you Bezier handles, and pencil you just kind of just draw like a normal pencil. We're just going to use CV curve and the normal kind of 3-degree cubic, which is by default on. And we're just going to left click, left click, left click, left click, left click. Remember, you have to draw at least 4 points to create that curve. And what we're drawing is kind of the overall shape or path of that circle that we created, right? In this case, we want to keep it pretty uniform, a good amount of points, so it'll look pretty good when it's extruded out. Remember, if you hit Enter, right, this will actually make the curve. Now, in the Curves menu, you do have something called Add Points tool, right? And what that does allow you to kind of keep adding points at the end of a curve you've already created, right? Now, if you wanted to add a point anywhere else, generally what you have to do is you have to go to, hold down right mouse button, curve point, and then you can just kind of drag a point here and go to curves, and you can basically, where is it? Insert knot. Insert knot. And what that'll do is that'll put kind of an extra control vertex in there. You're probably not going to have to worry about using that at all, right? And probably the most useful one out of that curves menu would be add points tool, because you can kind of, maybe if you stop the curve and you want to keep continuing it, that really allows you to do it super easy. Inserting knots somewhere else on it's a little bit trickier. It's not that hard, but a little trickier. You're honestly probably fine just drawing it and being done, hitting enter. But I figured, hey, there are a couple of options that you can use and things you can do with the curves menu itself. You're probably not going to need any of that stuff, though. All right, so now we've got that curve created. I'm going to tap spacebar to go out to my kind of 4 views again. And I'm going to put my cursor back over perspective and tap spacebar. Now remember, if you hold down spacebar a little longer, you can accidentally left-click here on the Maya word and change your views, right? So if you ever find your perspective view all of a sudden becomes like your top view, you accidentally changed that, right? You were so holding down spacebar too long and then left-clicking there and moving your cursor wherever you want it to go. So you can switch back to perspective view that way. If you need to, you can always go to panels and switch back here and here as well, right? So you can go to panels, orthographic, and you can even create front, back, left, right, top, bottom, perspective. But generally tapping spacebar just minimizes your viewport, and whatever viewport your cursor's over when you tap spacebar, it maximizes that. So tapping spacebar is kind of a minimize, maximize function. Now in this case, the curve's selected, and I've got W for move on, and I can move this down, right? There we go. Kind of put it in place there. Now what we want to do, I'll just hit Q to go back to my regular selection tool. I'm going to left click on this one, right? So we select the actual circle that we shaped first. That's the shape we want to extrude, right? And then we're going to hold down Shift, because remember, Shift adds to selections. It actually can also subtract selections, but so can Control, right? So you think of Shift and Control as your ability to add or subtract to from a selection. So I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to left click on this other curve. You see how that becomes selected also? The order that we select these does matter though, right? The shape that you want to extrude, you select first. The shape you want to extrude along, in this case these curves, the curve you want to extrude along itself is the one you select second. All right, so we select that one first, the circle that we shaped to be kind of the actual kind of shape of the chord itself with the ridging. And then we hold down Shift to select the curve we drew in ourself with the Create Curve tool, all right, CV Curve tool, because that's going to be the path we're going to extrude this shape along, all right? And we go to the Surfaces menu, right, because this is where we create geometry from curves, right? So if you've been creating curves or splines, right, curve and spline are synonyms, right? They mean the same thing. So when somebody says spline modeling, they mean this. So we go to Surfaces, and we see there is an extrude option. We've already seen this a little bit from Revolve and Loft from our previous projects and models. But we go to the Surfaces Extrude. Now I'm going to go to the options box for extrude though, right? So I'm using my cursor over that checkbox. And that brings this up. And that's important because there's actually 3 different styles of extrusion. There's distance, and if you're using distance, all you need is just one of these. So if you want to make curtains that just go straight down, you draw this curve, just select this curve itself, turn distance on, and it'll basically give you a length, and it's just going to extrude downward, right? That's all that distance does. Flat would kind of create a flat shape inside of there. Tube is what we wanted, though. So you can't just extrude one curve, and it'll basically just extrude it straight down, and so you get like, you know, curtains, right? Tube's what we wanted, though. And this is probably the coolest one, the one that you probably use this for most. There's kind of a reason why tube's on by default in the extrude, because that's what generally a lot of modelers use this for the most. So what tube does is it allows you to select 2 curves to create, well, hoses, pipes, tubes, ropes, cords, right? So we want tube, and that's usually on by default. Now the result position we want at the path itself. So remember, the second one, the one we drew out itself, that's the path. So we want the result to be at the path. Now I've also just found that the pivot component for how it kind of rotates around that it works better, and it's kind of more rotates it properly by using component. And then the orientation is just kind of the profile shape. So basically, I found to get the best results, tube, and then kind of everything below it. Tube and profile normal are by default when you open this options box up. You do need to usually, if you're going to use it like this, turn at path, so your result will be at the path itself, and component just to kind of get it to orient as it extrudes the kind of edge loops around there better. Now remember, that's not enough though, right? We don't want to create this as a NURB surface, right? We want to output this as polygons. So remember, if somebody tries to tell you spline modeling is NURBS modeling, that is not true. Not true, right? Can you use splines to create NURBS? Yes, but most modelers, for what we do, honestly hate NURBS, right? Can you get great results out of NURBS? Yes, but they're a lot harder and a lot more time consuming when polygons will get you there a lot faster and a lot easier with the same quality. Our industry is heavily polygons nowadays. But you can use splines to generate a polygon mesh, right? So that's what I mean by the fact that spline modeling is not NURBS modeling. You can create splines and output polygons and never have to touch a NURBS surface, just NURBS curves. So we're going to output polygons, right? Output polygons. It's kind of at the bottom here. Rotation should be 0 for this, and scale should be 1. That way it creates it uniform. If you actually change the scale, it'll make it taper, right? It'll get bigger or smaller as it goes along. So that can be neat, but we don't want it in this instance. So you do have these little extra controls here, but the default should be exactly what we want. 0 for rotation, 1 for scale. So I'm going to scroll down, and this is where a scroll wheel can be used as scroll wheel, right? Usually you want to use it as middle mouse button, but you can use scroll wheel to scroll down the slider. But we want to output polygons, output geometry polygons. And you'll notice it's actually already set up for me because Maya is pretty good about remembering, particularly if you're the only one using that Maya, it will remember what you did last time. So when we output polygons, remember we want it to output quads because quads are our favorite polygon, right? We also want the tessellate method to be general, right? By default, it sets to triangles and standard fit. And standard fit in particular creates tons of n-gons. Bad. The one you really don't want to use is standard fit, particularly if you want it to be all quads and all clean. Control points and count in general will all create quads, they just do it differently. Control points really just kind of just does it based on how many points are there. Count gives you kind of a generic count of polygons, which I found is kind of a rough approximation. General is my favorite though, because we have control over exactly how many edge loops we want going along this direction or kind of going around kind of the circumference of it, right? We also can kind of tell it to be uniform with per surface, which is what it is usually by default, per surf, or per span. I like per span usually, right? Not in every instance. Sometimes per surface can be great if you want something really simple and uniform. But per span I tend to prefer, right? And it's the only one in the per span, so there's really only one per span in there. Just kind of click those, pull down. Per span, it'll put in this number of edge loops between each vertex you created. That's why I love per span, is it's going to do it for each vertex. And what's cool about that we saw in our lamp is if you have more vertices in one area and less in another area, it'll put more edge loops in the area where there's more points and less where there's less. So it's more adaptive, right? That's why I tend to prefer it. So we'll do per span by per span. And we'll usually when I do per span, I keep these numbers low. If you're going to use per surface, right, you want those numbers to be higher, right? Because it's going to do that many edge loops for the whole thing. And if you have it really low, it's going to make something unrecognizable, right? So usually 10, 20, 30, much higher numbers is what you're going to want for these if you're using per surface. Per span, like I said, is more adaptive, so I tend to prefer it. So we switch to per span for both U and V type. Remember, that's just a way to think of like edge loops going this way and edge loops kind of going around kind of, you know, that way. And we want low numbers for that. 2 should be fine for both those. And we'll hit extrude. And there's our chord. Isn't that cool? Now, keep in mind that we have history here, and I want to talk about that a little more before I'm done with this video, because basically that's all you really need to do for your chord. But some of the things I want to point out is that, remember, history usually times for modeling is not that useful, right? A lot of software, Blender, Modo, 3D Studio Max, don't really have a normal history. They allow you to add a modifier for when you do need procedural modeling, because usually you don't need procedural modeling. Sometimes you do. A lot of times you don't. And we saw in previous videos that history, if you change it, it can do really horrible things to your model. When it comes to splines, though, it's actually really, really cool, right? Because what I can do is, and history is just a way to say that there is a connection between these, right? and that whatever you've done, all the operations you've done to something are remembered, kind of like real history. But in this case, it's a connection between the curves and this geometry. So if I select the circle up here that we created earlier, you'll notice that if I hit E for rotate, I can rotate this, and you see how it kind of changes the angle with which it actually does that? That's really cool, right? I can even do it that way if I really want to twist it up a lot. So it's really neat that you can actually use history to control that. In fact, if I hit 4 for wireframe, I can go in here and I can select both. In this case, I'm just left-click dragging the box. And remember, you guys don't even necessarily have to do this. I just want to show you guys you can do this. And I'll hold down Control to deselect the actual geometry, the polygon mesh. And I'll just make sure to put my cursor over the curve here. Hold down right mouse button. Not quite. So where mine gets a little annoying. Select the curve just by itself. Hold down mouse button, Control Vertex. I can just select a couple of curves here. And you'll notice I can move these up, and you see how it actually changes that as well. So that's one of the neat things about history in Maya, right? Probably where you're going to use it the most would be when you're doing some spline modeling for certain things like this. So when you have history between objects, that means they're dependent, right? That these objects are remembering everything that's done to it, right? And in this case, since it was derived from a spline, it's still dependent on those splines, those curves. And I talked about this on the revolve. Never hurts to talk about it again. Remember, I'm going to hit 5 for shaded. Remember, they're right here, the buttons for that, though. 4 for wireframe, 5 shaded. I'm going to click on the actual geometry. Because remember, you can also go to Channel Box Layer Editor up here, right? And you'll see that there's your history. It's in the input. So you get a Channel Box Layer Editor, you see there's the input section. And there's your extrusion, right? Because that's the first thing we did with this, right? So you can control that stuff and change those things if you wanted to, right? So if I want to play with that scale, that rotation, I could. But then there's the NURBS Tessellate, which is on top, because that's the most recent thing I did. That was the last thing that occurred to it. So remember, the very bottom thing is the first thing you did. The very top thing is the most recent in history. And you see when I go into NURBS Tessellate here, you'll see that there's the U and the V number, right? So if I wanted to, I could tell the V number to be less, like say 1. And you see how it actually does less edge loops this direction? I might even want it higher than 2. I might want it at 3, so it gives us a little more. Inverse, I can go to U and type in 1 for U, and you see how it makes it simpler there. I think 2 is fine for that, though. But isn't that kind of cool? Right? Kind of neat. You can kind of change those things around. You can even change your tessellate method, right? Count, fit, general. So remember, you have that history there for your object. In this case, I'll move this in a little bit. And we now have our chord, right? Cool. Move into position here a little bit. If I wanted the thickness of the chord to be a little smaller, I could go back and grab that circle. R for scale. I can make it a little smaller. You see how it kind of makes that chord actually smaller too? Really neat stuff. So history with curves can be kind of neat, right? Usually not so much, but in this case, quite cool. And that's often what people call procedural modeling, right? You can actually go back and modify the options for the tools, and they affect all the other stuff. So you kind of have numerical procedures you can follow instead of just kind of free-forming it and stuff like that. All right, so that's the lamp. We'll do a later cleanup outliner video for both scenes again. But remember, you can always kind of do it on the fly as you're working, right? Select all your objects, delete by type history. I'm not going to worry about that for that one right now. And that is the lamp.